Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is lecture number 14, which is going to be on representation of gender in culture and media. Now, before I start this lecture, let me tell you that the ideas, the theories, the theorists, the frameworks that we will address in this lecture sits at the intersection of media studies, cultural studies, literature. So it's quite interdisciplinary, and the purpose here is to bring in the gender lens and to critically examine how gender is represented in culture and media. So the purpose of this lecture is to help you develop a critical appreciation of the central themes, the central trends that we see in the study of media, gender and culture, and also help you apply some of the theoretical perspectives in the analysis of contemporary culture and media. So some of the key points that we will be talking about here is the role of language and literature in informing gender. So as we have seen in the past lectures, the role that language plays, the way that language develops, the way that language is used in communication, used in either through text or verbal communication. So the role of language is very critical in understanding how people communicate, how there's a shared understanding in any given society, and that is no exception in this case, because language just like other parts of social living informs gender relations in society. So we will look at some of the key theoretical lenses, frameworks coming from literature, coming from cultural studies, and coming from sociological studies to examine the role of language in understanding gender in society. And we will also look at issues of representation. So what do we mean by representation, and how our gender relations, gender norms, gender practices represented in society, particularly through popular media. So these are the key questions that we shall be exploring in this lecture, starting with an idea of the nature of the various cultures that operate in any given society. So if you look at the evolution of cultures across society, historically and in contemporary times, you will see that there are four distinct ways in which culture has evolved and culture continues to evolve. So the four ways are oral cultures, writing cultures, print cultures, and electronic cultures. So definitely this is not an exhaustive list of the types of culture, but these are the four significant ways in which sociologically speaking cultures have evolved over time and space. And in this lecture we shall be looking at some of the premises in writing cultures, some of the premises in print cultures, and some of the theoretical and current trends in electronic cultures. So as you can imagine that, as I said, the role of language becomes very important in this context. So, there are at least two broad types of culture, and it includes material culture and non-material culture. So, material culture is the one that you can see, feel, the tangible culture, and it involves the objects, belongings of any particular social group in a society. For example, you can see architecture. So you can look at an architecture and say probably at what point of time does it belong to. So architecture, transportation, these are indicators of material culture. A non-material culture, on the other hand, includes the belief systems and practices of a social group, the symbols and the meanings that are generated in a particular social group, and there's a common shared sense of understanding between the symbols and their meanings amongst the members of the social group. So you see that when we talk about cultural exchange or cultural transmission, or how cultures evolve over time, we denote to the belief systems, to the shared meanings, to the shared understandings, as much as we refer to the tangible indicators of culture, such as architecture and transportation. And in this lecture, you will see that the belief systems, the practices, the symbols, particularly the images, particularly in terms of representation in popular media, they go a long way to influence, to inform, or to redefine the way we understand gender in society, the way we understand gender relations in society. So as a starting point here, as a theoretical premise, we look at Edward Sapir and Benjamin Worf, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that looks at language as a tool in shaping the human mind. So according to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, language determines the human mind, and it has a very, very important role to play how the mind shapes up, and described language as a verbal symbol of human relations. So as I said in the previous slide, that these are the shared meanings, these are the shared practices, and language offers one of the vehicles through which verbal symbols of human relations are actually communicated. And this hypothesis is also noted for exploring the connection among language, personality, and social behavior, and for the idea of culture best being understood as analogous to personality. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis actually goes a long way to determine how we perceive, how we communicate, and how we have a shared understanding of culture, evolution of the human mind in society. So this becomes important, particularly when we try to understand the ideas of linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis states that language shapes our thought, personality, and culture, and if you can imagine language and culture as having two parts, linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity, then the determinism part refers to the thinking patterns and cultural practices in any given society, and the relativity part refers to the diversity in language, diversity in the conceptualization of language. So one determines how a society's thinking pattern grows, how a cultural or a set of cultural practices grow over time in society, and the other, the linguistic relativity, refers to the the diverse, the language, the diverse, the conceptualization. So if you have a society where there is only one language spoken, then the the breadth or the the boundaries of conceptualization will not be as diverse as in a society where you have multiple languages in operation. So just imagine the case of India, where we have so many different languages, and according to this hypothesis, the more the diverse is the language, the diverse is the conceptualization. So in a country like India, if you have so many different languages, the diversity in the conceptualization will also increase. So this is what is the idea of the linguistic relativity. The other theorist in this regard, who talks about the role of media particularly, and the role of discourse production in society, is Stuart Hall. And he's a cultural theorist. He's a Jamaican born cultural theorist, and according to him, culture is discursive. So a formation of culture takes place through discourse, and a discourse, according to Hall, is a group of statements which provide a language for talking about, that is a way of representing a particular kind of knowledge about a topic. So again you see the role of language becomes increasingly important here, where it becomes a way of representing a particular knowledge about a topic in society. And according to Hall, as you can well imagine by now, discourses are produced through language and practices. So if you have again a limited number of languages, you will have a limited type of discourse going on in society, and if you have a variety of languages in operation in a society, then you have multiple a variety of discourses operative in society. So discourses are produced by language and practices. So what people say and what people do together make up a discursive practice. They are ways of talking about and acting towards an idea or group of people. So again, these are vehicles, these are social vehicles through which culture is transmitted. Culture evolves over time, and as a result, language, since as you can see it is at the front and center of this identity or social identity formation, is also seen as power relations. So language gives rise to certain forms of power networks, power relations in society. So according to Hall, then discourse is written or spoken communication that conveys and informs culture. So the way that cultures evolve is through discursive practices, and one way that you can actually understand discourse analysis. So how do you analyze something that is coming from language and practice and people and actions? So one way of looking at discourse analysis is to understand, if you have say a body of text and then you want to make meaning of it, so you have a process of production of that text and a process of interpretation. So all of that comes from the descriptive analysis of the text, and the interpretation process of that text comes from how it was produced and how it was interpreted, producing the discourse practice. Now beyond that comes an explanation or a social analysis that is informed by sociocultural practices, that in what context was such a text produced? What was the background of of the production of that text? How was that text interpreted by society, by its reader? How did readership react? And then what were some of the socio-cultural practices or sociological indicators that influenced that production of that text and the interpretation of that text. And finally, you have a dimension of the discourse which is situational, institutional, and societal. So it is operative at so many multiple levels. So these are some of the dimensions that you can go through in terms of doing a discourse analysis. And while we are not going to look at discourse analysis in depth in this lecture, but it is probably going to help you to if you have a background knowledge of how this is done, to understand how some of the very subtle, very important gender negotiations are carried on in texts such as works of fiction, in literature, or in poems, in short stories. So if you can understand the basic premise of discourse analysis, it just becomes easier for you to appreciate how it is implemented in understanding or reading gender in literature. So if you look at some of the key methods of inquiry with regard to gender in literature, and if you look at one of the genres of literature in this regard, and here I'm going to talk about the diasporic literature, which so we find that there are several trends that we see. So one trend is questioning the established narratives of accepted social conventions within the nation and in the diaspora. So over time you will see that in literature you have there has been a genre that talks about the diasporic literature, either when the author is diasporic, or whoever the author is writing about, that group or people, the protagonists are diasporic, and there's a constant dialogue or a constant space negotiation, a social space negotiation that happens within these works of fiction, that questions, that challenges established norms, that that challenges social conventions, and then much of these negotiations are taking place between the protagonists within this space created by the author for them. The next method of inquiry that we can look at here are the various ways in which women and men affect transformation within their social contexts and create agencies through processes of acculturation within diasporic spaces. That we see that these protagonists are not just questioning, not just accepting or challenging these social norms. They're also trying to transform some of these social contexts, social norms, and as a result we see that there's a creation of agency, a question of agency, power and agency, as you understand by now from the previous lectures, through the process of acculturation within these diasporic spaces that are created by these authors. And the third process is the process of exploring queer spaces as investigated, and you have seen that the idea of queer theory which emerged as in the last few years as a response to a growing feminist call in understanding gender beyond the binaries, that the emergence of this queer space is felt not just in the tangible social reality, but is also transferred to much of these spaces within the literature. So we see a lot of writers, authors are actually exploring these queer spaces, investigating how are these queer spaces created within the literature, and how might the protagonists react or navigate through these spaces, and is it calling in for some sort of a social transformation or questioning established narratives. So how does all of that actually pan out to influencing gender in literature? So if you look at the various works of fiction that has been produced by or produced on the Indian diaspora, you will find that there are three distinct ways in which gender is negotiated in these works. And the three ways of looking at gender is, one is to read how you read about gender in in these works. The other one is how you write about gender. So by the first one is more heavy on the readers. The second one is more heavy on the writer, and then the idea of performing gender. So how are these protagonists interacting with each other in terms of gender, and then here the reader and the author actually merge in creating a performance for the protagonists in the work. So if you, for example, for the Indian diaspora, if you read works of say Jhumpa Lahiri, or if you read Chitra Divkarani's work, so you will see that there are intentions with which certain protagonists are introduced, certain contexts are introduced, and there is a reading side of it, there is a writing side of it, and there is a performance of gender side of it. So next time when you read any of these authors, or if you haven't read any of them, please go ahead and read. You will see that there is a very conscious effort of creating an Indian diasporic space, and how gender is actually in the center of the negotiations that carries on within these spaces. So when you look at gender relations, particularly in works of fiction, in diasporic fiction, there are we see that there are approaches with which identities are negotiated, and new forms of identities are created. So these protagonists are constantly recreating themselves in terms of these negotiations of identity, and we do see a lot of it going on in some of the key works of fictions in this case, which also to the reader probably allows for new interpretations of these texts. So if you're reading something, say a work of fiction which is not reality per se, but then it is giving you an opportunity to look inside, look into a world where something you probably do not know exists, but it exists in that world. So it gives you an alternative interpretation. It gives you a scope to find out what can be another interpretation of a similar context. And as we have seen that language here has again a role to play, in the sense that the text is the ultimate representative of narrative. So once you're writing, and you're writing in communicating it through text, it is the ultimate form of narrating something. And fictions give us a very nice space where we can celebrate interrogate or examine issues of gender quite firmly than would be possible in social reality. So it just gives us a space as a buffer where several of these experimentations, several of these questioning of narratives, grand narratives, questioning of social norms take place, and then it just gives us an alternative vantage point to understand some of the evolutions with regard to gender in society. So to bring in a feminist lens, a critical feminist lens to understand some of these works, if you adopt a feminist criticism lens, you are probably referring to an umbrella term for several varieties of critical analysis and interpretation of literature that use as a base some of the assumptions of the feminist movement. Now you have seen that some of the what have been some of the features or criteria or indicators of the feminist movement in the past, and it is just the idea of feminist criticism comes from there. It gives us a holistic term, an umbrella term that brings us with a variety of critical analysis, analysis and interpretation using some of the assumptions of the feminist movement. Now we see that over time several other distinct types of criticism have branched off, and we have seen how queer theory and gender theory have come branched off from there, and engaging in a feminist criticism, or relating theories, feminist theories have been quite political in this respect, because it is often used as a tool, for social and political awareness for change. So, just ask yourself the question that when might you need to use a feminist lens to understand literature? What are you looking for that a feminist lens would give you as a vantage point to understand some of these negotiations, gender negotiation, which you would probably not be able to understand if you do not use one such lens. So with that, it also brings us to some of the questions that a feminist critic may ask, in order to analyze, to examine any particular work. So, for example, some of the questions that can be asked is, in what ways is patriarchy present in a particular work? So, if at all, when you read a piece of work and if you want to use the gender feminist lens, then one of the first things a feminist scholar would look for is the presence or absence of patriarchal notions, norms in any given text. So, you would look for how are the effects of patriarchy evident in the lives of several of the characters in the book, and you will also try to understand if the female characters that you are reading about, they show signs of resistance to patriarchy. So, is it a silently accepted norm that these protagonists are dealing with, or is there some sort of a resistance or questioning of patriarchal norms? And then if there is a resistance, then how is that resistance portrayed? Is it a silent resistance? Is it a a revolution, or how is that resistance portrayed in that work? And then the third question, how are the concerns unique to women in particular place, time portrayed in the work? So how is the value system arranged in that particular work? How is the value system around gender, arranged in that work? So, are there any concerns unique to women that is portrayed or not, or are there any unique concern related to gender in this respect? And what are some of the gender value systems that are being talked about in that work? So, these are some of the basic questions that you can ask when you're trying to understand how gender operates within a given text. So, with that, we now transition to talking about gender representation in media, and here I will talk about a little bit about the cinema and about advertisements. But before I talk about any of that, let me walk you through an understanding of gender representation. So, with that, let me now walk you through some of the understandings of how gender is represented in popular media. Particularly, we'll talk about a little bit about the cinema and about advertisements. But before that, let us first understand how are some of the ways in which gender is represented. So, we oftentimes talk about two ideas. One is the idea of modernity, how we understand modernity or modernities, if there are multiple forms, and the colonial forms of representation or colonial constructions, as scholarship points out. So, the understanding of modernity comes with an idea in the economic process, where we equate it with the rise of industrial capitalism across the world. The idea of a political process, where we equate it with the rise of the nation state, or as a cultural process, where we equate with the idea of the separation of faith and reason, the rise of technoscience and secularization. So, it depends on which of these lenses are you using to understand a modern representation of gender in society. That are you talking in terms of an economic process? Are you talking about a political process? Because politically speaking, economically speaking, we have seen the emergence of categories of gender, such as the global South and the global North, the category of third world women. And then, are you talking about the cultural process, where you see as a separation of faith and reason? You see a rise of techno science, and you see the values of secularization. So, it matters which one of these lenses are you using to understand a modern gender representation. And on the other hand, you have the colonial constructions, which often looks at an universalization of womanhood and manhood. So, some of the earlier works on colonial constructions, we have seen that how these categories have emerged as mistakenly homogeneous categories of woman and man. And oftentimes, in the initial phases of the studies, they have ignored the racial and national connotations. So, what has produced over time is a gendered Western gaze in non-Western literature and film. So, this gaze comes much from the Foucauldian idea of surveillance or gaze in society, and it has produced a trend in media, in literature, in films, that there has been a production of the Western gaze in non-Western literature. But over time we have seen that the nature of representation, particularly in the cinema, has evolved. And if you can recall from a past lecture on normativity, where we talked about the growth of a queer cinema, the growth of a queer space within cinema, and particularly with regard to the inclusion of the various the indicators of differences, not just gender but race and class also. And particularly in the Indian context, we have seen the queer spaces in cinema have been explored quite actively. We talked about the works of director Rituparna Ghosh in this regard, and we have seen that how these spaces are actively created within the cinema. These queer spaces are created just to provide an alternative version, and an alternative version that gender exists beyond the binaries. And the popularity of queer cinema has been quite significant in this regard. If you look at some of the works of the Bollywood productions, and it's a very, very interesting paper by Margaret Redlish, where she's narrating queerness, exploring some of this narration of queerness in some of the Bollywood films. And as Redlish talks about that, not just queer relations are explored in these films. She talks about that creation of a diasporic space. So if you bring in a diasporic context to this negotiation, it just makes possible for a more fluid and effortless negotiation of queer identities. Vis-a-vis if it is just confined within the boundaries of the nation. So it is seen that from this work and several other works that are emerging actually in this context, is that gender is written about and performed within a context of displaced communities in which in the ways that question and resist traditional interpretations, allowing for an engagement with non-traditional versions of family and relationships, but only when enacted outside the geographical space of the Indian nation. And as is argued in this article, that we see that there is a particular negotiation of gender that is taking place, and but most of the time these alternative versions are negotiated within a diasporic space. So if you are interested, you can go to read up this it's actually a chapter in a book that talks about the various ways of performing gender, and it just gives you a very nice idea of how queer spaces are being created in Indian cinema, and and globally also, to bring in newer understanding of the evolution of gender in society. Now we also have a test that several of the communication or films or text can be put through. It's called the Bechdel test, and it tests how well women are represented in movies. So if you look at how the Bechdel test is formulated, that whether a film or a work of fiction portraying at least two women who must talk to each other regarding something other than a man. So if the film or fiction qualifies on all of these 3 points criteria, then it is said that the film or work of fiction has passed the Bechdel test. But as you can see that over time in this graph, which shows from 1970 to 2013, that several of these films have not passed the Bechdel test, and will not see a film or work of fiction passing this test unless it is qualifying with the three criteria of portraying at least two women who must talk to each other in the film or in the work, and they must talk about something other than a male character. And this is from a recent study by Garcia et al., where they have examined, they have applied the Bechdel test, and they have examined some of these conversations, some of the criteria, the three criteria that you saw in Bechdel test, as applied to cinema and social media such as Twitter and MySpace. And as you can see that what emerges is a gendered pattern, and you can see the dialogue imbalances, the fraction of shares, and you can see the dialogue imbalances in MySpace in the US, in the UK, and Twitter in the US. So it's a very interesting way of looking at gender negotiations in films, in gender how gender actually plays out in many of these works of fiction, and it does bring out a lot of these gender trends that are not detached from reality, because after all these works, we call them works of fiction or we call them cinema, but in the end there is some sort of an influence either they have on society or society has on them. So it's not completely disconnected from society, and it is in a way a reflection on a reflection of how society actually functions around certain gender norms, gender values at that given point in time. So how does gender then pan out in advertisements? So we have seen that scholars have talked about advertising, the role of advertising in in the communication of ideas, in the communication of attitudes, and in the communication of values. So they form cultural forms through its signifying practices. So in a way, if you recall that how we talked about culture as being a shared pattern, a shared sense of understanding of symbolic practices. Advertisements give us a nice space, a nice scope to talk about that communication and transference and sharing of practices. So we see that one of the significant studies by Goffman in gender advertisements, where he says that we learn a great deal about the disparate power of male and females simply through the body language and poses of advertising. So if you take any advertisement, for example in the Indian context or globally, and if you look at the body language and how the proponents, the protagonists in the advertisement actually pose for that particular advertisement, a lot of that actually comes out as a result of disparate power of males and females as is conditioned in that particular society. And we have a study by Bovee and Ahrens in 1986 that how do a reader, or how do a reader of advertisement comprehend an advertisement. So what they say is most readers of advertisements first look at the illustration. So what is the image? What is the image of the advertisement, or how is it illustrated? Second, read the headline. So now I've looked at the image, now let me read the headline. So read the headline. And third, read the body copy in that order. So, there's a process, whether at a conscious or a subconscious level, that most readers of advertisements actually follow, and this is the pattern that you first look out for the image, then you read the headline if you find it interesting, only then you read the body of the advertisement. And according to them, visual images therefore carry a great deal of responsibility for the message decoding in an advertisement. So, the images that you see of advertisements, they offer some sort of a gender code. If you are looking through the gender lens, they offer some sort of a gender code, and the ability to see that message as a gender code sheds a long way, goes a long way to for us to understand how gender is actually operative in that particular advertisement. And in that regard, Stuart Hall again proposed a framework for understanding how we encode and how we decode meanings and structures of program. So according to him, one of the starting points is to look at some of the frameworks of knowledge in any given society. What are some of the relations of production, and what are some of the technical infrastructure in that particular society. Now, depending on that, a population or a group of people or a social group, they attach meaning to that that image or a framework of knowledge, which is kind of encoding. So it's a process that is attaching some sort of a meaning to that advertisement, and that makes what the program a meaningful discourse. So see, Stuart Hall, who we saw, talks about discourse analysis and talked about how discourse of how cultures can be discursive, and here using the case of advertisements as vehicles of cultural evolution, we see how a program, how an advertisement can become a meaningful discourse just by the process of encoding by its viewers, and then this becomes once established as a meaningful discourse in society, it undergoes a process of decoding and providing meaning for a new sort of framework of knowledge, or comes back to the same one. So you see, this process of encoding and decoding is extremely important in this case, how a discourse is formed. So what are the shared meanings in a society, and how are these meanings used? Coding, offer a code or attach a code to this discourse, and how over time, then, if you encode certain programs such as advertisements, they become discursive practices, they become how people communicate in society. So Stuart Hall's theoretical framework in this respect of encoding and decoding is also very, very important, very significant for us to understand how some of the transformative learning in cultures take place, how we look at particular cultures using an understanding of our cultural lens, but how often do we actually question the lens that we are using? So so cultures who have gone through transformative learning have probably found out an explanation of how these cultural lenses are used. So when you look at advertisements next time, it would be helpful if you can bring in this theoretical understanding of encoding and decoding to see how several of these frameworks of knowledge that is already operative in society, reflect on how we understand a particular advertisement, how we understand a particular image or a message in an advertisement. Now, several studies, in recent times have shown that when we talk of images of women and men in advertisement, there are several notable trends. So, some of the trends coming from various studies are that women are rarely shown in out-of-home working roles. So again, this comes from the binary, the idea of duality. So all the ideas that we have talked about previously in this course, that most of the time what gets translated as is the biological differences, and therefore because there is this strict boundaries between the public and the private spheres. So in the advertisements that were analyzed, women were rarely shown out of home working roles. The next trend, not many women were shown as professional or high level business persons. So again, this is a general trend that the studies point out, that not many women were shown in the high level business levels. Women rarely ventured far from home by themselves or with other women. So again, we come back to the constant comparison between the home and the outside, so the public and the private, and how one category of people is identified with only one space. So why is there a problem when one category tries to transgress this space? For example, if women tries to move into the public sphere, and if men want to move into the private sphere. And most of the women in the advertisements that were analyzed were shown as dependent on men's protection. So again, the nature culture a debate, if you can recall here, and also the homemaker breadwinner model falls in place with this trend. Then men were shown as objectifying women as domestic adjuncts. Females were most often shown in ads for cleaning products, food products, clothing, home appliances, and men were most often shown in advertisements for car, travel, entertainment, industrial companies. So several so particular types of products showcased only one particular category, gender category in this regard, and that brings out a lot in a society's understanding of gender norms, understanding of how gender is organized in a society, and which is a reflection of what we see in these advertisements. Now, if you look at some of the contemporary advertisements in the Indian context particularly, we see that although not in great details, not in a great large number, but we do see that the social marketing strategies around gender roles, family values, and changing practices in marriage have been at the forefront of many of the new advertisements that we see in current times. So we see that advertisers, whether it's a product for a home appliance, or a product for that can be used by anyone irrespective of gender, or whether it caters around family values or practices in marriage, we see that these messages are picked up by the social marketing teams of advertisers, and they are played out in many of the recent Indian advertisements. We see a role reversion or a role inversion in terms of gender in many of these advertisements, and we do see that new forms of gender scripts are actually coming out of these advertisements. So if you can recall, what has been some of the new advertisements that you have seen on television recently that fall in place with these points that they have talked about changing family values, talked about changing gender roles, talked about changes in gender role or role inversion, or changing gender scripts. So if you can identify any one of these advertisements, these are screenshots from various recent advertisements from the Indian television, and you can see that the first is an advertisement for an apparel. The second one is an advertisement for washing liquid product. The third one is an edible product, and the fourth one is related to sports. And see, so you see the variety. If you are not familiar with any of these advertisements, I encourage you to find out more about what each one talks about. But they do talk about changing roles in gender. They do talk about role inversion, gender role inversion in society, and they do talk about the changing gender norm in Indian society. So with that, I want to conclude that we are talking here about a social construction of reality, and the three ways or the three indicators in this respect are habits, roles, and status. These are classic sociological concepts that help or inform a long way towards our understanding of how we construct realities. And if we look at say habits, which are the same actions repeated every day giving rise to patterns. So if the habits change or not change, if the roles or the individual behaviors that are socially accepted and inform social status, they change or they don't change, and the status or the person's access to resources and benefits in society, that changes or doesn't. So depending on how each of these indicators, each of these parameters evolve over time, the social construction of reality, of social reality, will also evolve over time. And I've just shown you of some of the significant examples in this lecture, how much of the social construction of reality takes place through culture and popular media. So I do want to leave you with a question here, that what are the various types of spaces that gender representation in popular and social media has produced, and how? So I want you to look into how are these social spaces created as a reflection of gender representation, whether it's conventional or whether it's new form of gender representation in popular and social media, and how has that space evolved. So I would encourage you to look into that. If you're interested for a further reading, please read up Dasgupta and others, media, gender and popular culture in India. And in the next lecture I will take up gender and the environment. Thank you.